Good morning, everybody. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our discussion today for Thursday, April 13th, 2023. And as I did promise to you, as I did say, the CSU, Colorado State University, did release their forecast today just about an hour ago, and I said I would review it for you, and here I am doing it. So without further ado, let's get right into it. What did Philip Klotzbach say from the Colorado State University? Well, he predicted a slightly below normal season for this season. He said 13 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 2 major hurricanes. And he does say it's a combination of factors, and we're going to talk about this throughout the video. I actually have a few slides of my own to bring up in reference to what he might be talking about. We're going to break down his prediction, talking about a relatively high chance for El Nino, but currently there is also a very warm tropical and subtropical Atlantic present. And this is what I've been saying, that would be a lot of back and forth between what we need to really think of, because we have two factors that are both contradictory, if you will, to each other. We have a very warm Atlantic, and we usually associate that with more atmospherically favorable conditions for Atlantic seasons to be active, but then there's also a potentially pretty robust El Nino expected to develop, and that could, in response, suppress instead of favor Atlantic seasons. He did tweet more though, and we're going to break it down as we go along. But first, this is his tweet here that he has on Twitter, released his forecast, and then he talks about the primary reason for the slightly below average season is, of course, El Nino, which is expected to be quite significant, and he has a few models that he brings up. This is the European model from the April 1st forecast, and you notice quite significantly they have a very strong El Nino. Some forecasting all the way up to almost close to 3 degrees Celsius above normal. That is a super Nino that the model is forecasting for, and this is the European. The European, not the only one that is also forecasting though, and this is just a really quick let the ocean anomalies that have occurred so far. The NMME scale is also forecasting a very strong El Nino too, kind of getting up to the moderate strong range. I believe that I would say is right near 1.4, 1.5 degrees Celsius, I would say. And that is also another very potent El Nino. So that is one factor he's saying, and very important to mention that El Nino is known for reducing wind shear across the Caribbean and tropical Atlantic, which is why we always generally we view El Nino as a inhibiting factor. But then he also mentions that the eastern and central subtropical Atlantic is currently much warmer than normal, which is a more favorable look for the Atlantic, despite the fact that we have El Nino. He says that that's the reason why we have the seasonal forecast at just slightly below normal. And we could actually look at it here too. We see right now, though, in the current time, there's April 12th, of course, updated as of yesterday. If you do know, the Northern Coral Reef Watch usually updates always a day behind, but it does update every single day. And you notice the very warm tropical Pacific, and especially what is a lot of people that are talking about a very warm look off the South American coastline, and this is very much associated with surfacing sea surface temperature anomalies from below the surface, very warm, and also one of the warmest on record there for this time of year off the coast of South America. And usually most of the years that rival what we're seeing right now are known for being very strong El Nino years. So that's something that is getting a lot of attention, a lot of people's attention, a lot of people's eye. And I would assume that's part of the model's output as to why a lot of models are saying there could be a very strong El Nino. But then I do recall that Philip does also mention, Klotzbach also mentions this very cold northern Pacific look that is associated with the cold PDO of the Pacific. He does talk about that a little bit in his discussion, and then he also mentions the very warm Atlantic. And as I want to stress it again, these are two factors that really they seem to be coming in on each other, almost colliding with each other, because these are two factors that usually have opposite effects than what they do to the Atlantic hurricane season. El Nino being the one that more or less favors the Pacific and suppresses the Atlantic of tropical convection because it brings rising motion into the Pacific, which in turn, in the upper levels, brings strong westerly winds across the Atlantic, which translates to wind shear. While the opposite happens when we have warm sea surface temperature anomalies like we do right now in the Atlantic, very warm in fact. That tends to help lower the sea level pressure anomalies in the Atlantic, and in turn reduce the wind shear in the Atlantic. But those do tend to happen in more or less opposite years, which is why we're really questioning what this year will be. And I did find interesting though, and this is by the way on the document of Philip Klotzbach's forecast, and I'll link this document if you want to read it all yourself. I just read it really quickly over the last half hour, of course, to present it in the video. But if you want to read it on your own, because we're not going to read through the whole thing, we're just going to go through section by section of little bits that I found interesting. I'll link this document in the description if you want to follow along while you're watching. But one thing I did find interesting is going to his April statistical forecast scheme, one of the statistical methods he uses to forecast. And I did find interesting that the January to March, no, that's not it. The January to March SSTs in the tropical and subtropical Atlantic. And he does mention warmer than normal SST anomalies in the tropical and subtropical Atlantic during the January to March time period are usually associated with weaker than normal subtropical high, which reduce the strength of the winds, the wind strength during the boreal spring. And he also does mention positive SSTs are correlated with weak trade winds, which and a weaker upper tropospheric westerly winds, which is what is stronger in an El Nino year, and also lower than normal sea level pressures and above normal SSTs in the tropical Atlantic during the following August to October period. Now that's very interesting because we are expecting that during the August to October period we would have an El Nino to develop, and that would usually mean stronger trade winds and more of a suppressing factor atmospherically for the Atlantic. But the fact that we've had this being warm for basically the entire winter so far, the Eastern Atlantic, Philip Klotzbach does mention that usually that would correlate to a more favorable look for the Atlantic as well. And I think this is very interesting that if we go down to his predictors, he has analogs that usually he releases that he uses as reference points for his forecast. Hold on, let me just see if I can try to find it. It's usually somewhere down here, but I did find some pretty interesting analogs that he used as an indicator this season. I think, hold on, I actually think it's on his Twitter feed. If I'm gonna go, damn, sometimes I realize I should have prepared earlier, but there we go. Philip Klotzbach, he does mention that the August to October sea surface temperature anomalies, years that had potent El Ninos, but also that also very warm Eastern Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies. He does mention some of those years being 1969, and then there was also another one that I found interesting, 2004. We all know how that year went, but that was interesting, and I did find that he included there, so that's something to keep in mind. And also 2012. One thing that all of these years have in common, 2012, 2004, and 1969, and I actually should mention really quickly, 2012 wasn't really El Nino. It was more like a warm neutral that was on its way towards the El Nino, but I guess it does correlate well enough that Philip Klotzbach then did end up using it, because we were heading in the direction of El Nino. I assume that that's the case, but nonetheless, it's on the list. And I do find it interesting because all of these years, they were warmer ENSO years, but they also were very active in the Atlantic. If I remember correctly, 2012 was a very active year. Of course, that was the year of Sandy, if we all remember, especially those in the Northeast. 2004, that is self-explanatory. We had a hyperactive season for hurricane landfalls in Florida, and that's actually quite interesting because it's usually a statistical idea that in El Nino years, hurricanes and tropical systems that develop in the MDR tend to recurve and go out to sea. That is typically the case in most El Nino years, but 2004, we all remember, was not like that. It was El Nino, Madoki if you want to be more specific, but it was El Nino nonetheless, and we ended up having 4 hurricane landfalls in Florida, and then there was 1969, and a lot of people do not remember this year. I guess because it was far out, it was very much in the past. It was before the 1970s. It was right when the satellite era begun. But I decided to bring up this little statistical table from the NOAA Climate Prediction Center. This is basically a list of all ENSO years and the strengths of the ENSOs through the 3-month time periods dating all the way back to 1950. And we go to 1969. That year was also a El Nino too, and if you look, that year was also quite active. We had 18 storms, and if I remember correctly, 12 hurricanes. And if you remember that one storm that happened that year that a lot of people talked about before Katrina happened, Camille, a Category 5 landfall in Mississippi that happened that year, and it was El Nino. And the El Nino was actually not that bad too. It was a 0.9 degrees Celsius El Nino during that year, and it also was coming out of a year that was previously El Nino as well, and a moderate one too, peaked at 1.1 degrees Celsius above normal. And by the way, really quickly, because I did want to bring it up, this one, if you're not sure what we're talking about when it comes to El Nino and La Nina, this is just a little bit of a refresher to those that are not sure. And so an El Nino, La Nina is usually calculated through this region. In the Pacific, we have the ENSO regions, La Nina 1, 2, which is what everybody's talking about being much above normal and record warm for this time of year. The Nino 1.2 region off of the coast of South America. Then there's the Nino 3 and the Nino 4, which stretches basically most of the equatorial Pacific. And then right near the date line, right near the central Pacific, that's where the ENSO, El Nino, La Nina indices, the indices from the Nino 3.4 region, that's where they matter the most as to the factor of El Nino or La Nina. And this is where we calculate the Nino 3.4 region, because it's in between the Nino 3 and the Nino 4, and the Nino 4, if you get it, if you understand, if you get it. But the bottom line is that area was actually quite decently in El Nino strength in 1969, and we had a quite interestingly above normal year that year, which is why I do find 1969 to be a very interesting analog from Philip Klotzbach. And I think I should also mention 2002 as well. 2002 was near normal, especially to our standards. 2002 was a slightly below normal, near normal year, but there was, in fact, quite a few impacts that year. If I do remember correctly, Hurricane Isidore made landfall on the Yucatan Peninsula, did drop quite a bit of rain, and I think, if I do remember correctly, was a major hurricane landfall there. And there was also Hurricane Lily, which threatened southwestern Louisiana. Did weaken upon landfall, but it did threaten southwestern Louisiana as a hurricane and a major hurricane eventually as well. So 2002 also had its fair share of impacts. Of course, there's 2006, 2009, and then there are 2014 and 2015. All those years were below normal, and 2002 was also slightly below normal, at least to our climatology in present day, which is why I would assume that it is rightful to assume that Philip Klotzbach would, of course, put the forecast that he has as slightly below normal for his forecast for April. But there are still some interesting analog years which we need to keep in mind. And if you do look really closely through the forecast, I'm going to try to zoom down to the ENSO discussion, because he does mention it is still fairly uncertain, as noted here. He says, it is noted earlier that there remains considerable uncertainty if we transition to El Nino, and if we do, how strong El Nino would get by the peak of the Atlantic hurricane season, because I do recall, especially over the last few weeks, a lot of people saying that if it wasn't for the SST anomaly configuration that we're expecting in the Pacific with a warmer El Nino and an El Nino setup in general, and especially a robust El Nino like the models are forecasting, it will be very interesting because the Atlantic, at the other hand, is very warm, and usually in very warm Atlantic years, a very favorable Atlantic is favored, I should say. And so it'll be very interesting to see how strong this El Nino gets, because you also remember me mentioning, if you've been here before on this channel, how I mentioned that sometimes in these years where we have ENSO and the MDR, the Atlantic warmth, battling between each other, sometimes the Atlantic can win out, and sometimes those years can be very, very, very intense. And so this is something that we'll be watching very closely. The Nino 3.4 index, if you want to keep it on tabs on a daily basis. This is from Tropical Tidbits Analysis, Ocean Nino 3.4. You can just copy this URL up here, or you can go to Tropical Tidbits. Actually, I'll show you really quickly how we do that. We go to Tropical Tidbits, we go to Analysis Tools, Ocean Analysis, and then you can see right here the Nino 3.4 index. This gives you updated information daily on the Nino 3.4 index and how it is. And I'm saying really closely to watch this over the next few weeks. Watch how this progresses, and watch how strong and how positive we get into the warm territory, which is above 0 degrees Celsius above normal, which is basically where we are now. How warm do we go up here, or how much do we stay closer to neutral, or how much less we go above this 0 degrees Celsius line, and how much more do we stay within the lower area, meaning a weaker ENSO than what the models are saying, or of course if we're going on the stronger side, how warmer we're going in the map. It's really going to depend, and it really will have a very big impact on the hurricane season. Really quickly, do want to bring up other forecasts. I'm going to go to this website. Should have prepared this earlier, but whatever. Noticing though that it is still a bit of uncertainty though, because we have the TSR release their forecast, very similar to CSU's forecast in December, and they also released another similar forecast last week. University of Arizona though, and I did see their forecast. I'm actually going to bring it up really quickly. Why not? Let me just click on this link. But they are actually going for a very active season, and they did mention somewhere in here that the anomalies are forecasted to be the highest. The current sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic are the highest since 2010, are even hotter than 2020. And for the Nino 3.4 region, the SSTs are forecast to be among the highest. The high Nino SST should help bring down hurricane activities, and it'll be interesting between the battle of these two sides this summer. But the University of Arizona, I believe it's Kyle Davis and Zubin Zhang, if I'm saying the forecaster's name correctly, from the University of Arizona, saying that it'll be very interesting to see how these two factors battle. CSU as well is saying it. And by the way, really quickly, did want to mention the CSU website if you don't want to read the entire forecast from the CSU. It is on their website as well, tropical.colos, that COLO state.edu, and then forecasting /forecasting.html. They do have the forecast on their website here, and it has the table, the straight to the point table of what they're forecasting: 13 storms, 6 hurricanes, and 2 majors. If you don't want to go through the full forecast, but they're mentioning here too, it's going to be very interesting how the anomalies in the Atlantic battle between each other, and of course the anomalies in the Pacific battle between each other, because really it's very interesting because we've not had this pattern that's set up, and it's really going to be very interesting to see how these two interact, because one favors one thing and the other favors another. So will we see a battle between these two factors, and how will it turn out? Will the Atlantic end up being above normal, or will the Atlantic end up being below normal? Well, it just depends on what exactly occurs, but CSU did release their outlook today, and they did say that it was slightly below normal. They do think it'll be slightly below normal because of the battle between these two factors, but you never know. Maybe we could start seeing more one trend in the other direction where the Nino looks like it could end up winning out more, or the Atlantic gets warmer and that ends up winning out more. It all depends. It is April, though, mid April. If you take a look at the date, April 13th, and there's still a lot more uncertainty to go because we're still further from the season. We're getting closer. I think we're now less than 50 days away from the season. Yesterday was 50, so we're getting close to the season. The uncertainty is still there, but we still have a lot to look over the next few weeks. More forecasts will be coming out too besides CSU. This is just one out of many forecasts that'll be coming out over the next few weeks, and this is not the only CSU forecast as well. Let me scroll down really quickly because they usually release the date for their next forecast. And they say they'll be releasing 3 more forecasts. One will be Thursday, June 1st, the start of the season. Another one being Thursday, July 6th. And the last one being Thursday, August 3rd. So they have more forecasts coming. So certainly there's going to be a lot of change between then. So expect there to be change and expect things to shift around. We're still only in April. And things especially not even from now till June, but now till even August or September, sometimes things could change quite a bit. And we've seen that in the last few years where sometimes the early season was not as favorable, but then come peak and we end up still getting some devastating storms to occur. Even in El Nino or not, those type of seasons still happen. And I'm pretty sure things will definitely change over the next few weeks. And even through the early season as well, we'll see, differences in what occurs and a lot more forecasts to come out. And I do think that'll be the right time to say that. If you want my opinion, I'll be releasing my forecast roughly a week from now. Little less. It's going to come out Wednesday, April 19th, next week. So if you want to see my forecast then and you're not subscribed yet, that is important too to mention. Please subscribe, because to keep a community here tracking the hurricanes and also keeping on top of conditions to what to expect for the hurricanes, especially now since we're in April, is the better time to do it so we could prepare now in advance instead of being, left out in the dust when there is a hurricane coming and you're not prepared, Always good to prepare now, especially when it comes to these hurricanes, especially with the activity that we've been seeing in the last few years. And I think this is important to mention now that even let's take last year, for instance, was not that active, especially compared to the last few years. But what did we still get? We still had Category 5 Ian, which came into western Florida, devastated Fort Myers and that area, and caused a lot of damage. And a lot of people were caught off guard. The death toll for Florida alone from Ian was in the hundreds, which is one of the highest it's been for years, because a lot of people were caught off guard. That's why it's important to always keep your guard on the tropics, even in a year that maybe this year where we have uncertainty, especially since we're having multiple factors that are colliding with each other. Always important to keep on top of what's going on now, so you are prepared for when something happens later. And that's why it's always important to always be prepared no matter what, and always, of course, why we're doing these predictions now, so we could keep you prepared to what's going on and what might come up, at least, because we're still not entirely sure. But what we do know, at least right now, with the knowledge we have right now, make, you could say, an educated guess. Is how they say in school, educated guess. We can make an educated guess as to what we think could happen in the future. It all depends, though. But with that being said, that's it for me for now. That's my review of what the CSU forecast was for today. If you like it, please subscribe. As I always say, like and share with family and friends. Develop community, and I will talk again Saturday. If you're just joining this channel, keep in mind that we do outlook and discussions on the tropics and off-season discussions up until we start hurricane season, or up until May 15th. That's the start of the Pacific season. Up until then, I'll be doing discussions every Saturday, weekly, so we always have something new to talk about, especially since we're getting closer to the season. And then after May 15th, it'll be every single day. I'll be doing a discussion till we get to the end of the hurricane season. So if you're here for that, please subscribe. Please like and please share as well, so we can get more people to subscribe, like, and of course build a community. That's it for now. See you Saturday. And also let me know what you think. Let me know what your prediction is. And if you want to ask me questions, ask me in the comments. I'm here for that. But for now, that is it for me. Talk to you later.